So great. Hello, and welcome to our second webcast in the Azure Foundation series. My name is Patrick Treptau. I'm a lead cloud architect here at Glückenkanja GAB, and I'm joined here by my colleague, Matti Puolitaival. Oh, I almost got it right.
Yeah,
I almost got it right.
But you did well. So, hello, my name is Matti Puolitaival. I'm a senior consultant here at Glückenkanja GAB, and happy to be together with you, Patrick, again.
And now I got the slides back up and running. So good. So we got that fixed and out of the way as well.
Great way to start the webcast.
Yeah, exactly.
With a slight technical difficulty. Yeah.
Exactly. Well, we got some great updates for you. I mean, this module is in this module we're talking about all the governance and compliance and actually building up the first step of building up your Azure Foundation. Also has been, we want to share some updates with you. I mean, there's been some changes now, actually some great updates, not only from the Azure Foundation, but also professionally, that we finally completed the merger between Glückenkanja and GAB. You know, we got some cool new gear, and we got the boot camp going on for next year. So we're really proud. We've been working on together for a year, but now also legally and officially, we're one company as well.
One big family.
One big family, and we're great to work together and actually have you here online with this webcast. Now, we just want to do a short recap for those of you who haven't watched the previous series, which was just an introduction into the Azure Foundation, and we're just want to go a little bit into the details of the what and whys of the Azure Foundation. What's the need, why we need an Azure Foundation. And maybe, Matti, you can give us a brief recap around that as well.
Yeah. So what the Azure, or why Azure Foundation? So first of all, it's a collection of, or enterprise-ready collection of best practices from Microsoft, also experiences from us, maybe in total tens of years of combined experience. Mm-hmm. And typically it covers roughly 90% of the customer's needs what comes to the first Azure landing zones. It provides an infinite scalability. Mm-hmm. It's really highly efficient, providing the flexibility for the developers, application teams. It's built on top of the, or 100% on top of cloud native services, and all of the complexity is managed with the infra-as-a-code templates. Mm-hmm.
So there's actually a need for Azure Foundation because the concepts are so different from an on-premise environment in terms of, you have to name your resources right, you have to find a really good structure and build up your environment and your tenant onboard your tenant in a certain way. So what does it actually entail from a technology point of view? What does it actually include? It's a best practices, it's a framework, it's a backend, it's a management infrastructure, it's all of that, right?
Yeah, there's actually quite a lot in what comes to the foundation, but if you break it down into smaller components, it contains the organizational structure, so the management groups, subscriptions that go with those. Then obviously all of the security aspects, so security centers, policies, logging, monitoring, compliance. Then automation to provide app zones for application and development teams securely in a standardized formats. And then obviously automations and tools to manage the environments at a really big scale.
Mm-hmm. And it includes, most of it is based about infrastructure as a code. We don't want to actually go into the portal and deliver or actually click your way through the different portals, but we want to deliver that as infrastructure as a code, and we choose Terraform actually as our main provider for that as well.
May I correct? Mm-hmm. All of it is based on infrastructure.
All of it? Yeah. Okay, great. So just as a small recap as well, we have the 4 stages of the deployment. So what they kind of highlight of how we get onboarded with the Azure Foundation as well. And we have that 4 different layers that combines a parameterization workshop. We go into deep a little bit later. Then we have the actual deployment that actually happened, meaning the deployment of the infrastructure as a code. Then we have a handover and training of the customer as well, and then optionally a managed services onboarding through our managed services organization, right? Yeah. So next step, we want to actually share some development updates. We have been very, very busy in the background too. IT doesn't sit still. Microsoft Azure doesn't sit still. There's always new things that we learn from customers, new best practices that we incorporate. and we'll just want to present to you a couple of the developments update that we had since the last webcast. And I think the first one is the layering concept. We have a new layering concept in place. In the previous webcast, we showed you the different levels that the Azure Foundation actually consists of, and we've expanded that quite a little bit, right, Matti?
Yeah, exactly. So if you remember from the previous webcast, we showed the layering concept of that time. So it consists of 6 different layers, with which we split the whole Azure Foundation into smaller kind of quantities that, and so that we can manage the deployments better and so forth. But based on the recent developments, what we've seen in the field, we decided to implement the new layering concept, mainly to better handle the separation between global and regional resources. So, for example, the virtual WAN, that's a global resource, but then you have the regional hub VNets, that are kind of tied to the specific regions. So we split the virtual WAN and the VNets into their separate layers. Same we did for the audit trail and the foundations, which we are going to have a closer look today. But in overall, I think the setup we currently have is kind of a more geared towards really big scale. So.
Okay, great. So if I'm a previous customer of the Azure Foundation with the previous layering concept, can I get onboarded or can I continue with the new layering concept as well?
Absolutely. So there is a way to migrate from the old layering concept to the new one and continue using the environment or already deployed environments as they are.
Oh, cool. The next one is we worked a little bit on the enterprise scale. You make it a lot more, let's say not enterprise ready. It used to be enterprise ready, but we worked a little bit on the base setup on the different management groups, right?
Yeah. So we decided to adopt the enterprise scale as the kind of a fundamental part of the Azure Foundation. And what the enterprise scale is, it is the opinionated way of setting up the first landing zones and management groups to organize the Azure use. And the biggest changes you can see that there's on how we organize the, let's say, platform services. So there's now a dedicated management group to group all of those together. And underneath that, you have the identity management and connectivity management groups to have a clear separation between identity providers, the network connectivity layer, as well as the management components.
Okay, cool. So I understand on the left side with all the platform, that's all the base infrastructure, everything that you need actually for the Azure Foundation. But the actual workloads, they live in what we call landing zones, and the different landing zones it's highlighted here and kind of split up between a corporate internal environment and online environment that might be exposed, to the internet, like a classic DMZ environment, and an SAP environment as well. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. So this is just one representation of how the landing zones can be done. So split the workloads or split the landing zone based on the workload types. But of course, there's possibility to customize that based on for example geographic separation of the environments or something else. But yeah.
Super. The next one was we actually developed a naming provider for that, a foundation naming provider where you can dynamically, based on different variables, get the resource naming up and running, because we highlighted in the last webcast the need for a really good structured approach when it comes to naming your resources, because mostly in Azure you cannot rename your resources after the deployment as well. Can you talk us a little bit through it, what that naming provider entails?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is something or actually one really brilliant developer of us has came up with. So we noticed that in order to provide consistent naming for the resources that we deployed, we tested a couple of modules. They really didn't do the trick for us. They were hard to maintain. So we came up with the idea of creating the naming provider. So what the naming provider is it is actually a provider for Terraform, open sourced, and can be used by anyone. And how it works is that for each customer there's one single schema file in which we define, after the customer has decided and signed off the naming convention that they would like to utilize. We input that into the schema file, and then having the schema and the provider with those, we can create the consistent naming for all the resources that we create.
Mhm.
And after the project, we can share the schema file for the customer. Their teams can continue using the same provider, same schema, and then schema file, and then have also consistent naming for the applications or other workloads that they deploy on top of the Azure Foundation.
So it's not a static naming convention that we have for, let's say, all of our customers, but it can be tailored to the needs for each customer as well, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So we can adopt the naming based on what the customer has decided. So while it doesn't solve the issue of how to name resources, it definitely solves the issue of how do I apply the naming convention that we've chosen to use into the actual real environment.
And how do you actually get along with those resources in Microsoft Azure that have to have unique names, like a storage account or an app service as well?
Yeah, that's a good question. So with those, we can of course always revert to use the random strings generated based on certain parameters and use those as a part of the naming for the resources.
And with the power of Terraform, even if it errors out or the name would be taken in the unlikely event, we can still reapply that as well. And I think that's a big advantage why we actually also went to Terraform, that it actually collects the actual state as well and can implement the changes on the fly. Yeah. The next one is probably also, well, one of the biggest one. It's we added the implementation of virtual WAN into the Azure Foundation, right?
Yeah, I think we briefly discussed this last time, but we finally have the implementation for Terraform for virtual WAN, and have actually already deployed a couple of customer projects. And we already implemented a couple of different routing scenarios. So whether you want to use the secured vHub with the Azure Firewall or set up an isolated VNet routing topology, that's all built into the foundation. We can deploy it for you.
Mm-hmm. And virtual WAN, as I understand, it's just really a combination of combining different express route and VPN connections or so all together to onboard all the different branches to well, let's say the Azure world, right?
Yeah, it's kind of a way to create an interconnected mesh of Azure networks, branch offices, and data centers through the express route circuits, for example.
Cool. The next one was also quite a big move. We moved from internally also for the development from Azure DevOps to GitHub. Can you get us a little bit more insights around that, of why we chose that and what the advantages are from GitHub as well?
Following the industry trends, we also decided to move from Azure DevOps to GitHub. Have been really happy with the move. Also, the customers are being moved. Or most of the customers have been moved already as well. So. Loving it in GitHub.
In GitHub, super. Well, now we're going to get a little bit more into detail about the governance and compliance options that we have in the Azure Foundation. And if you take an overview about all the different options that we have or what's included in the governance model of in Microsoft Azure, we're going to start with the management groups. And that's very important that you have the first logical separation of your environment, that you get that in place. And obviously that changes. That's, not for every customer is different for that as well. Then how you actually organize your subscriptions and attach them to the management groups, and then Azure policies. And we'll go a little bit more into depth into the Azure policies as well, and then we'll talk about role-based access control. I think that's all that's included, for the first step of actually onboarding or getting up and running with the Azure Foundation, right? The first one is actually the management groups, the Azure management groups. And that's a most overlooked or often overlooked layer of separation that you have first, where you can actually separate the different business units, like we showed before actually in the graphic about the enterprise scale, that you can separate different workloads or Azure resources from each other. For example, an SAP environment might have completely different policies than a sandbox environment or an online environment. And because you have the Azure policies and role-based access control mostly applied on the management group, subscription group, and resource group layer, it's important to actually have that structure really good up and running, and we'll see that later on in code as well. Yep. The second one is the Azure subscriptions. And I thought also in the beginning of the Azure subscription, just in terms of, well, where does the money come from? But it's actually another layer or another grouping, a unit of management where you can actually separate your management groups with each other, with different, for example, not only for billing reasons, but you can also apply Azure policies not only to management groups, but also to subscriptions
Exactly.
as well. And lastly, I mean, that's one of our, well, I think almost not favorite components in this module is Azure Policy, because Azure Policy is so powerful that you can do. It's almost like you can compare it to group policies that you have on-prem to a Microsoft Azure environment as well, where you can set different resources that you cannot actually set with RBAC rights. For example, allowed locations and that. But it goes further than that, right? It's not a one-time apply, but it also has some other advantages, right?
Yeah, just to add on that, so one of the kind of our favorites for me is building the security compliance directly into the platform with the Azure policies. And like you mentioned, there's always, let's say you have an existing subscription that has been living there for maybe even years. There's always the way to or means to remediate the existing resources through the policy to make them comply with the policies that you impose.
Exactly, and that's probably one of the main difference between traditional group policies and Azure policies. The term remediate, is make it so environment. If it's not compliant, a compliant state in Microsoft is usually a yes and a no. You're compliant or not compliant. But if you're not compliant, you can make it so. It's almost like desired state configuration in the Microsoft world, right?
Exactly.
And then lastly, we'll talk about role-based access control. And role-based access control in Microsoft, it's actually fairly simple, but it goes a little bit more, it's more complicated if you have custom roles with that, and you want to define custom roles. One of them might be what we see in the bottom left, is the virtual machine operator. You just grant rights to certain users or subset or user groups, for example, just to start and stop a virtual machine as well. And all that RBAC components with different, based on Azure Active Directory groups is already included in the Azure Foundation, correct?
Yeah.
Yep. So what we have now is actually what we want to do. We want to get a little bit more practical. And we've actually, kind of thought, how can we best demo all of this to you? And we have a customer case, but it's actually, a fictional customer based on all the different customer sizes that we have and the needs of a customer. And so we generated that, and we looked really, really hard for a really good name for a customer, a fictional customer name. Some of you might already know that or recognize that name. And it's, Contoso Group.
I think I just can't put my finger on it when I've seen this before.
I think I heard that before.
Sounds familiar.
Yeah. So, Contoso Group is really just a fictional company. It's a medium-sized conglomerate. It has its main data center in Berlin, and has separate data centers, smaller offices, branch offices in Zurich and in London. And they have different business units, just as we described a little bit earlier. They have an IT department, they have a human resource department, a finance department, where the actual production services are happening, and an SAP environment. And we just wanted kind of to replicate that and build in this webcast and the upcoming environment, build up our Azure Foundation based on that customer scenario as well, right? So we also get prepared a little bit background story, and that's also based on what we actually hear from customers. With Contoso Group, they started testing in Azure, they're starting some POCs, how the different resources work, and it kind of over time organically grew. So they created resource groups, they created under the resource groups some resources, and after a while they learned that that whole concept, that might not work. I have to rename something. I have maybe to apply some Azure policies on that was previously unknown. And then it's really, really hard to actually make some changes. If you even wanted to rename a resource or maybe even move a resource to a different subscription, it can work, and in probably 80% of the time it might work just well, but in 20% of the time you have to spend a very, very long time for that. So they've kind of experimented, but they want to actually now really get up and running with the Azure Foundation to actually have a structured approach with the naming conventions as well. And we're going to use this customer right now to kind of demo and onboard them to the Azure Foundation.
Yep.
And for that, we created a management group layout. Well, that's actually the same slide as before, but that's actually what we want to implement in terms of the different landing zones, the platform, or actually the platform management group, the separation between the platform, the landing zones, and maybe a sandbox subscription.
Yeah.
So that sounds great. Now, what's the first step if I want to actually get onboarded? Once I've seen all the marketing material, I'll say, well, this is really interesting. What do I need to get up and running? And I think the first thing, what we also showed in the previous slide, is a workshop with the customer.
Yeah. So it all starts from the parameterization workshop. Typically, that's a 1 or 2 day exercise together with the customer. So where we sit down with them, go through each and every layer, each and every component or service that we have in the Azure Foundation, discuss what it does, and then hear the customer, hear their needs, hear their visions, and then decide upon on how this specific component should be implemented for them. So it can be how customizing the management groups or creating custom policies on top of the defaults that we recommend. And at the end of the parameterization workshop, we collect all the kind of a decision points into a decision log, and that is then fed to the next stage of the deployment, where we actually start to deploy the environment for the customer.
Okay, but it's not as simple as just getting information from the customer and adding variables to a script, but we'll just really get into it's a different project actually for every single customer, because like with management groups and all that, the layering and all the different tiering is completely different from no customer is alike with that as well, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So even though standardized framework might imply that it's a really rigid set of stuff that we deploy, but actually there's quite a lot of customization that can be done. And if those customization options do not, let's say, cover the need, we can of course always further customize, create a new feature for the customer just to be able to have their needs met.
And then the next step, once we're done with the parameterization workshop, is actually the actual implementation and the deployment, right?
Yeah. So once we've done the parameterization workshop, we have the decision log. That's when we actually start turning the gears, so to say. So one of our consultant will set up the environment. That can be, or that means setting up the customer environment ready for setting it up for the foundation, and also preparing the GitHub environment, setting up the projects, the organizations, repos, workflows, and so forth.
So every customer gets a separate GitHub project, because again, no customer is alike.
Absolutely. Also to separate the environments completely, there's always a GitHub organization per customer.
And the GitHub repository is actually laid out in the same way that we had actually described our layering concept. So once we're going to first start, we start with a level 0, with a launch pad, and that's really just the onboarding of the tenant.
Yeah, exactly. So in the launch pad, that's the only layer that we actually deploy manually. We have a predefined script which will prepare the customer's tenant, set up the root management group, create the storage account for the Terraform state files, and also prepare the service principles that are used to the deployments. And then in addition to setting up the customer's tenant, it also prepares the GitHub for the deployment. So it creates the secrets, or imports the secrets in the GitHub, creates the workflow files that handle the deployments, and in general sets up the GitHub for the deployment.
Okay, so that's actually a connection between GitHub and the customer's tenant.
Exactly.
And the onboarding of all the requirements, Terraform infrastructure, like something to store the Terraform state files, some secrets maybe in an Azure Key Vault, and all of that.
Exactly.
So what's the next layer after actually deploying the Launchpad?
So after Launchpad, we start the deployment of the audit trail. And audit trail, if you remember from the previous webcast, it's the method of or service to collect all of the Azure activity logs from all of the subscriptions into a central place. If hopefully not ever needed, but if needed, those are there too. So you can go back in time to see who did what and when and where in kind of a worst case
Yeah.
scenario.
And it might not only be useful for, kind of finding out who did what in Microsoft Azure or actually with the automation, but also maybe for compliance reasons as well that you have to do, there are regulatory reasons as well.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So, and in addition to the audit trail, it also sets up the enablers for the centralized monitoring. So creating a centralized log analytics workspace and storage accounts to where to ingest the monitoring data from all the various sources that you can have.
And obviously you want to get that up and running as quite early in the deployment stages as well, that you can monitor all the different deployments once we actually move along on the different levels. Yeah. And then we have the next layer. And the next layer is actually, well, the main layer that we're going to talk about today is pretty much all the components about governance and compliance.
Exactly. So the next layer on top of our audit trail is the foundations, and that sets up the governance. So includes the management groups, creates the management group structure, imports all of the custom policy definitions, policy set definitions, then assigns, creates the policy assignments, and on top of the policy assignments also manages the role assignments for the policy assignments in case the policies are kind of a type of deploy, if not exist or modify. And finally creates the custom role definitions and assigns predefined groups into the management groups to provide the access for the customer.
Cool. All right, let's get into it. Let's show and take a look how that actually looks in the back end from the provisioning point of view, and then we'll take a look at the front end. How does it actually look in the customer's tenant, right?
Yep.
Super.
Let's go into the demo. So let's start from the GitHub end. So what we have here is the GitHub organization for this imaginary customer, cleverly named Contoso Group. And like I said, there's always an organization per customer. And within that, we have then the repo for the Azure Foundation. We've done quite a lot of the setup already just to save time. Typically, it takes maybe an hour to do the first deployment of the management groups and policies. So we are not going into that during this demo, just to keep our audience entertained. But so in the foundation, it is based on always based on our latest development repo, and then once we have the cloning done, once we have the Launchpad setup done, we have, for example, the GitHub Actions, where you have the workflows that are actually responsible for deploying the environment to the customer's tenant. So looking at audit trail deployments, we can see the history of all of the audit trail deployments that have been deployed to the Contoso group. Same for the foundations layer, all of the deployments for the adjusting the management groups, adding new policies, new role-based access control roles, etc.
And we show later a little demo if you make any changes to the code, how actually the workflow looks like, not only from you, but also from the customer's backend as well.
Exactly. Yeah. Then if we want to have a look into the real live environment, so starting from the management groups view in Azure portal, you can see that there's under the tenant root group, there's the Contoso group, which into our terms is called customer root management group. And selecting the Contoso group, it takes us to the next level where we can see the decommissioned, the landing zones, the platform sandboxes management groups, which you showed earlier on the presentation.
That's the same layout that we showed earlier, that we put on paper and actually gathered all the data from a parameterization workshop, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Drilling down further, for example, let's use the platform. There's the next layer of management groups. So you have the connectivity for storing connectivity subscriptions, let it be virtual WAN or the regional virtual hub subscriptions. Then identity management group for as the home for identity subscriptions. Let's say in case you migrate Active Directory servers to Azure, then management for the overall management of the whole environment. So the automations, the update managements, and so forth. And looking at the details of the platform management group, if we start from the access control blade, There's a couple of example groups that we've assigned as a part of the foundation. So there is a couple of groups. First of all, connectivity admins. They have been granted reader permissions to the overall platform. Them being responsible for the network layer, so they need to see whatever happens on this part. Then there's an assignment for the root readers. Let's say maybe cloud owners having the overall visibility to the whole management group tree, and so forth. Then going further into the policies. So we can have a look on policies that have been applied on the platform layer.
Wow, I just take a look. That's 225 to 222 compliance. That's a lot of policies.
That's actually resources. That
okay.
Sorry. So on the platform level, there's already policies that we inherit from the customer root. So Contoso Group, there are policies, for example, requiring the mandatory tags, inheriting tags from resource groups down to the resources and so forth, and then general tags, general policies that deny, for example, HTTP access to web apps or functions and so forth, just to kind of impose a secure configuration from the get-go for all environments.
For someone that's new with Azure policies, what would be, if we go a little bit more in detail, what would be a popular or a policy just to describe that environment? What would be a policy that's globally uniquely deployed by every customer as well?
Yeah, I think good example would be secure or preventing creation of any services to respond with HTTP, for example.
Okay.
So applying to web apps or functions or storage accounts. Even though nowadays, especially if you deploy something via portal or through the example templates that you have available in the network, they are usually already creating secure, really secure configurations. Of course, there's always the possibility to manually adapt the configuration to deploy something with unencrypted connections or not implementing the encryption, default encryption at rest. And with those policies, we ensure that that's not possible. So you are not able to create or deploy a resource that has a configuration that, for example, does not encrypt the data at rest or encrypt the data in transit.
Oh, cool. So how does it look like now on a resource group level? With the resource that maybe I want to see like the naming conventions as well. We'd showed now the management groups and the subscriptions and the policies and some RBAC as well. And then we can see here all the different resource groups that we have in the back end. And notice we have some naming conventions actually already in the background that's incorporated into that.
So the environment does not have that much going on it as of yet. And also this highlights the fact that there will always be resource groups that are automatically generated by Microsoft. And for those, you just can't apply the naming convention that you've decided to adopt. But the rest of the stuff that we deploy via the Terraform, those have the naming convention applied as defined together with the customer and then translated into the schema file.
Oh, cool. Okay, super. Great. Well, now maybe if we're ready, we want to make some changes to the environment and maybe, perform some changes maybe with policies or resource groups or so. Can we have a demo or look at that? Maybe you in the way as me and as the customer, and you actually as the driver or the developer in the background as well, where I'm saying, well, I have a requirement maybe to change the retention time, maybe for different resources as well. I'll give you, I just want to change retention time. I maybe want to change the term allowed locations where I actually want to and are able to deploy resources as well. And of course, there's a lot more policies, but maybe we'll just go through one workflow in how to highlight some changes or the initial onboarding of the customer with the code environment.
Yeah. So for the demo, we prepared a couple of changes that we are going to implement through the kind of a normal way of managing the environment with Terraform and GitHub Actions. So first change that we are going to apply is the policy that we discussed about allowing certain resource group or allowing creation of resource group only certain regions. So for that, there is an issue which we created together, and I've actually worked on the change. Based on the change, I've created a pull request, which implies that there's something I have done, some change that I've done, and I would like to incorporate that change into the main code, main branch. And I've assigned you as a reviewer for this. So maybe while you do the review in the background, I'll walk through briefly the view.
Yeah, I'll look here at the review. I opened up here my pull requests actually in the background, and I'll see that those open issues are ready for me to review. So what I can actually do, I'll do that here in the background. I can review that, I can comment on that, and then you'll actually get the response that is actually cleared for the deployment. So while you're working on the back end, I'm just going to review. I got here, for example, I got two requests. We probably don't have to show it for the locations policy for the Azure landing zone and for platforms, and a request here, then also a review for the retention time. That's going to be increased. So while you are actually working on the background, I'm going to just review this. And
while we are waiting for Patrick to review the pull request, I'll walk you through quickly the pull request workflow. So whenever we are doing any changes to the code base, the changes are always done in a feature branch or on a branch, or not directly to the main branch. And whenever we are happy with the change, we want to implement the code into the live environment, we create a pull request, and then we go through the pull request workflow of Patrick reviewing the change, seeing that it's actually implementing what we've agreed. Then there's also a host of automated checks that are run as soon as the pull request is created. For example, Terraform validation, running a Terraform plan to see that the change is actually something that can be deployed. And I can see that Patrick is in progress.
Yep.
So let's have a look into. When the Terraform plan runs, so checks the template set or the change that it is something that can be deployed. There's also an kind of a feedback into the pull request, showing what is the actual change that it's going to, or how it will be done in the live environment. So I can review the Terraform plan output. Highlights me that it's about to create 2 policy assignments to landing zones as well as the platform management groups. Looks good. It's exactly as it's meant to be.
I just reviewed and approved those changes. You should be able actually to see that as well.
Okay, I don't know why this didn't update, but well, for the sake of demo, let's merge the branch. So let's assume you were happy with the change, and it's something that we can merge. So let's merge the branch to the main. And as soon as the merge has happened, there is an GitHub workflow picking up the change, and it is starting to apply the change in the live environment. So within a matter of couple of minutes, the change should go through, and we can see the actual change in the live environment. For the sake of the demo, there's also another pull request regarding increasing the retention time of the audit trail. So currently it's been set to 90 days due to the new compliance requirements. We need to increase it to 360 days. So for that, I prepared another change into the code where I propose a change of increasing that 90 days to 360 days. There is also, you've been added as a reviewer, and if I go through the pull request, we can once again see the Terraform plan that has been successfully run. There is the output showing what is the actual change that this pull request will do. So we can see in the audit trail we are increasing the retention time of the audit trail logs from 90 to 365 actually. And we are happy with that. Let's close the output, and then shortly after the foundations have been run correctly, I can merge this change to the main. Of course, for demo purposes, it failed, but let's do the merge to the audit trail.
And I just noticed, I saw my comment in here that I approved.
Oh, okay.
So, yeah. That it's also a review for you, that you can see if something's not working. I can actually enter a comment and saying, well, no, this changes is not correct and needs to be maybe adjusted as well. Yeah.
Exactly. So let's have a look into the GitHub workflow where we are setting up the audit trail.
Mm-hmm. Oh, this is actually now the Terraform deploying the changes. You did the plan before, and automatically plan what would happen, a validation, and now is the actual implementation of the code.
So we are currently looking at the outputs of the GitHub workflow. So currently it's running a Terraform plan. Mm-hmm. So it's once again reviewing the change, checking that it is something that can be deployed. It passes the Terraform plan check. And once the plan is passing, we can see it looks good. There's the output of the changes that are to be done. Then it goes to the next stage, which is Terraform apply, where the change is actually implemented in the live environment. And as we can see, the Terraform apply passed as well. In total, it took like roughly a minute to run through the workflow. And if we go into the live environment, checking the audit trail, so going into management groups, Contoso group, audit subscription, and inside the audit subscription, we have the resource group for audit trail. And within that resource group, we have the log analytics workspace. And if I check the usage and estimation costs and data retention, we can see that the data retention in days has been increased to 360 days as imposed in the change.
Mm-hmm. So it's not only with the Azure Foundation, not only code that I'm going to apply. It has a review process in it. It makes sure that everything is consistent. It performs some changes before that as well. So I think that highlights the power of the Azure Foundation. Apart from clicking yourself through the interface and everybody's supposed to can do everything in the portal. That's just a good demo of how to apply governance and compliance. Obviously, we cannot really demonstrate to deploy a complete environment that will take way too long in the background with a parameterization workshop. But I hope it gave you some insights in how actually to deploy, some Terraform, some snippets actually for the Azure Foundation as well, and how we actually onboard the customer. And in the next webcast, we're going to expand that, and that's probably more interesting, or then also interesting as well, because we don't have any network yet. Yeah, we're going to start actually setting up the network as well, and that was just taking our Contoso group through the onboarding process, through the first steps of how we actually generate the management groups, the subscriptions, the Azure policies, and a role-based access control. So I hope that little snippet and the little bit demo was really helpful for you. And I think that was already pretty much it for a customer. So we're just trying to expand on that customer, on our Contoso group customer or so in the upcoming webcasts as well, and building up the environment. And that's pretty much also we're already through with everything that we wanted to talk about. Thank you so much for your time. And I hope you're gonna all stay safe and healthy. Just a quick note, after us, we have our colleagues, Jan Geisbauer and Niels Krautkramer with another exciting webcast around also Microsoft Azure, and they're talking about Microsoft Azure Sentinel as well. That's a webcast coming up at 2 o'clock. And in the meantime, thank you so much, Matti. It was really great working together. I'm looking forward to the next webcast as well. And thank you so much for actually watching the webcast as well. Please, if you have any comments, you can write us directly an email as well. We had our contact information on the slides before. if there is anything that you want to see, we can also create a custom demo for you, or actually answer all your questions. And until then, I hope you're going to stay healthy and you're going to stay safe. Have a great weekend. And we're going to say goodbye here from Offenbach.
Yep. Thanks a lot, Patrick, for the time, and have a nice weekend.